Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. My name is Eli Lake of the New York Sun, and I am here today with Heather Hurlburt, former White House speechwriter with President Clinton, and particularly Sandy Berger, and currently a blogger with Democracy's Arsenal. Heather, how are you doing today?
Hey, good. Great to be back.
Maybe you could tell us about, because it's kind of the 5-year anniversary of a very influential article that you wrote for the Washington Monthly called War Torn, which talked about why Democrats have a hard time talking about national security, which I can tell you I read at the time and reread last night, and in many ways is just as relevant today as it was when you first wrote it.
Yeah, I have to say, if you had told me 5 years ago that I would still be talking about this article in 5 years, I think I would have run screaming out of the room. But 5 years ago, back in the sort of more immediate post-Clinton period, I wrote a piece coming out of my experience working on foreign policy on the Hill in the Clinton administration, overseas at arms control negotiations, basically talking about how the Democratic Party, as we knew and loved it, had a culture that had made it much less likely that people would come along and get interested in the party from a national security perspective. And so you had sort of a senior generation of Democratic Party operatives who either just didn't know and didn't care much about national security, or were really formed out of the Vietnam era and actively felt uncomfortable and dirty having to have anything to do with it. People become politically active Democrats for a set of reasons, most of which, I have to say, this is one thing I think has changed. But at the time, people became politically active Democrats for a bunch of reasons that were mostly domestic or human rights related, whereas people whose real sort of primary interests in life were military strength, overseas intelligence, that kind of thing, were much more likely to end up being politically active Republicans, and that had consequences in how the party structured itself around elections and how your sort of average political Democrat talked about national security issues. And obviously after 9/11, this was just a huge, huge problem where you had the public suddenly, what we call it in public opinion speak is it became a threshold issue, that there's a certain chunk of the electorate who has to know that you're serious about security before they can really hear what you're saying on anything else.
Sure.
So the point being 5 years ago that Democrats were just at a huge disadvantage sort of sociologically because of who we were. And 5 years on, two things have happened. One is that the party really understood after 2002, and I think even more after 2004, that we had a problem, and that naming a decorated combat veteran as the presidential nominee actually wasn't enough to overcome the problem. Mm-hmm. So the party, number one, the party has done a lot. There's a great project I'm involved with that Jane Harman has actually started a PAC whose sole purpose is to train Democratic congressional candidates on talking about national security issues. So people who may never have had any contact with the military or with national security issues actually spend some time sort of learning the basic on the issues, getting comfortable. You should go to a military base, you should talk to the soldiers. These are things that people feel comfortable hearing. These are things that sound patronizing or uncomfortable. Right. Here's how to treat these folks like the human beings they are. So that's one piece that has happened. And, across the party you have a kind of greater awareness of this. The second thing, frankly, that happened is that the Iraq debacle has driven a lot of people who are interested in national security back toward the Democrats. And one really obvious manifestation of that was the fighting Dems, that you have this class of, I believe there are 5, I could be off by one or two, Iraq veterans who are freshman congressmen this time around, and of course there were even more who ran, and you just wouldn't have imagined that even back in 2000. So the cultural ground has really changed. And I think the last thing that is changing is that there historically, dating back to the Cold War and post-Vietnam and the 70s, the public has trusted the Republicans much more than Democrats on national security issues. And even now, with Bush's approval ratings so low, terrorism is the one, not interestingly foreign policy anymore, but just terrorism is the one area where Republicans even get a plurality, not, I believe, a majority, but a plurality of greater public support. But the numbers have fallen dramatically, and so you see for the first time the Democratic political establishment thinks it's worth contesting national security. Before it was sort of change the subject as quickly as possible, and the cultural shift that's happened that I modestly think I've had a little bit to do with, but lots of other people have as well, is to say, no, you don't actually have to change the subject. You can you can win the argument on this subject too. And that's a huge cultural shift from 2000.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, a couple things have happened since this essay was published. I mean, I think one thing is that a big chunk of sort of national security-minded specialists who would have been Bush 1 Republicans have teamed up with Democrats. From my perspective, that's okay in some ways, because I didn't like the Scowcraft wing that much in the Republican Party anyway. But so you do have like the Lawrence Wilkerson Democrats who think, I think Lawrence Wilkerson, has gotten a lot of mileage out of what essentially is a falsehood, which is that, his side was sort of iced out by some shadowy cabal, which is nuts. I mean, there were decisions that were made in the first Bush administration that, went against the neocons absolutely. And it's very much, there's a paradox in how Bush approached the world. I would certainly say that. But if you look at overall his approach, outside, Iraq, but sort of the Middle East in general, what you see is a policy of regime change, I think, for Iraq, and then pretty much regime preservation for everyone else in the region, because there was an effort, articulated, I think, by Flint Leverett in a cover story a year ago for the American Prospect, to use the constellation of friends and foes in the Middle East, these autocrats, as our front line against al-Qaeda. And this is certainly one model, that has been attractive to some Democrats. The other thing I'd say is that another strain of thought, which is actually one that I would like to see Republicans kind of get back to, which is just sort of the Richard Clarke view, which is that I think Richard Clarke, under any other normal circumstances, would never be really someone who you would put in the Democratic camp, because he obviously has no problems whatsoever. If you read that Delende memo about what he wanted to do in Afghanistan, it's an orgy of international law breaking. But there is this sort of view that, like, Iraq was terrible because it was the wrong move for the war against al-Qaeda or Islamic radicalism or Islamic terrorism or what have you. Then I think, though, that there's this other camp in the Democratic Party which you really got to reckon with. And sometimes it's not in the Democratic Party, Heather. Sometimes it's outside, like in the Clinton years. And these are the people who I think would like to see American hegemonic power significantly reduced or relinquished to some other institution, which is to say that they're primarily not interested in having conversation with those, as you put in the article, reactionary jerks in the military, because they don't want to see America have a very big military at all. And in fact, in their flights of international peace studies fancy, they will talk about the idea of, like, not even having an American military or this sort of thing. And the Democrats would do well to marginalize those people and tell them to vote for somebody else, I think. But that's me. So I think that those are sort of the tensions at this point. And then there's you, the Kosovo Democrats, Madeleine Albright, the people who I think are really not that different from the neoconservatives, who want to use American power in this moment in world history to advance what are, uniquely exceptional American values, and to do so in a way that not only enhances our security, but but sort of sees our enhancement of security in the world as also an enhancement of political rights and economic security, if you will, for other people in the world, and to sort of see those two things coalesce. So those are sort of my initial thoughts.
Gosh, I could go on about that forever. Starting at the end first,
yes.
If I had to pick one word that differentiates my wing of the Democratic Party from neocons, that word would be modesty. That I think, yes, we are susceptible to dreaming great dreams about how the world could be a better place, but I think both tempered by reality and also by just a little bit of that far left skepticism about just how great American hegemony really is.
Right.
The place I'm ideologically comfortable is a place that dreams great dreams and says, okay, now let's think really hard about this before we do it, and let's ask ourselves, what is the best likely outcome. So that's point one. Point two, on the extremes of the parties, what I think is so interesting is that if you all don't watch it in the Republican Party, you're actually going to end up with a fringe that is at least as damaging to you, and ironically, you're going to have caused it, because it's a group of people that are going to be so dismayed by the end game in Iraq and feeling that the troops were betrayed and noble ideals were betrayed and all of our allies betrayed us, and that I think you're in danger of seeing a kind of crazy, I hate to use the word isolationism because I think that's a somewhat outdated construct because in point of fact, isolation doesn't mean much anymore when we're,
right.
importing all our cheap food from China and cheap labor from Mexico and et cetera, et cetera. But that you are going to have a real wing of crazies out there, which, as you say, some of whom won't actually be in the Republican Party, but they'll be clustering around it, and they're going to make it very hard for either the neocons or whatever is left of the Scowcroft wing to craft a more kind of rational approach to national security. And, my third point, back to your comment at the beginning about kissing the Scowcroft wing goodbye, is that I think you're really going to miss them. Because,
never.
All right, not you.
Good riddance, Brent. I don't need it.
Not you personally, perhaps, but I'm a real believer that you actually get the best policy when you have some creative tension and you don't have one group of folks running wild and uncontested.
Well, the neocons are not running wild and uncontested in the Republican Party. It's the biggest myth that's out there on the internet right now. The neocons, basically, they won on obviously the idea that Saddam Hussein was a major threat, and there was no point in trying to co-opt him the way that maybe we did try to co-opt Syria or Iran or other places. But it lost on, so many other things, including Ahmed Chalabi, whether you should make it about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, there were, a series of issues on which the neocons lost that somehow their, ownership of the entire debacle in a lot of ways. And I'm not as prepared to call it a definite debacle yet, but in that respect, I mean, it's sort of a little unfair. I've always thought that's been a bit unfair. I mean, they were the highest-ranking neocon in the Bush administration. Really, it wasn't Cheney. It wasn't even really Bush. It was Paul Wolfowitz, and he was a deputy defense secretary.
Okay, so then I have two questions for you. What is Dick Cheney is my first question. And second is, the many miscalculations, lack of planning, failure to understand what would happen on the ground, extreme hubris that went into the Iraq War aren't the fault of the neocons. Whose fault are they?
Okay, well, let me explain about the extreme lack of planning, okay? The problem is often described as in the Fallows article in The Atlantic, this guy named Tom Warwick, who was at the State Department, wrote this brilliant plan for Iraq, and, the Pentagon and Richard Pearl or whatever read it, and they said, no way, we're going with Ahmed. That's not really what happened, all right? Here's what happened, all right? There were 15 plans for Iraq, and 1,000 flowers bloomed. There was a plan in Basra with the British. There was a plan in Mosul with General Petraeus and his first thing, where he opened up the border with Syria and said he was going to work with the Baathists against, other Islamist groups. There was a de-Baathification plan that applied within Baghdad, but then there was a re-Baathification plan that applied with Nouri I forget his name, but anyway, it was one of Alawi's son-in-law, where they brought in the most senior guys into the secret security services, and then, there was a million plans at once, and there was never any decision. And then the real legacy of the Bush administration is that Condoleezza Rice failed to actually just pick a side and go with it. She was always a Solomonic solution. So there were people who wanted to say, listen, we got to take out Sadr, and this was after they believed he killed al-Khoui in 2003, in the first month of the war or so. And then there were people saying, no, you got to sort of bring him in. And so how did they solve this? They did the worst of both worlds. They didn't bring him into the government. They didn't reach out to him and said, okay, there's a place for you here. And then they didn't kill him. So it was sort of there's there's a series of very bad ideas that sort of look worse because there was never any real decisions that were made. And then there was Bremer. And Bremer, I think, is hardly the neocon. The neocons wanted Jay Garner, and Bremer came in and, kind of made decisions and who knows how this guy made decisions, and a lot of them were very bad. And obviously getting rid of, decommissioning the entire Iraqi military and then not instituting pensions was a terrible idea. But I would argue bringing in the worst of the Baathists into the kind of new Muhabarat to replace the old one was probably also a pretty bad idea, and so forth. So, and then there was a plan for Kurdistan. So, you could kind of go on, and I think that the real problem was that there was a jockeying within Washington for 2003 and half of 2004 about who was going to turn up to be the winner in the big Iraq game. And that was that, and the lobbying and the political fight internal to the Bush administration in Washington was played out in Baghdad, which was the real disaster. We should have either we should have had one plan and stayed with it, and instead we didn't have anything.
So what does it say about both the quality of folks in this administration and the advisability of ever having done this in the first place, that nobody was able to come up with one plan either beforehand or during?
Well, I think it was a failure of leadership. I mean, I don't have a problem with saying that. I mean, Bush failed in that he needed to understand. I think Bush wanted to do this war, and even before the war in the AEI speech, he talked about the idea of bringing democracy to Iraq. And I love those ideas. But if you're going to do that, recognize that this is a revolutionary idea and a revolutionary war and a revolution in our own foreign policy. And you can't simultaneously bring freedom and a democratic system to Iraq and then expect all of Iraq's neighbors to want that outcome for Iraq as well and try to bring them into the process, and then expect that you're going to get much from guys like Lakhdar Brahimi. Lakhdar Brahimi is the guy who sort of he oversaw the Taif Accord, which was Syria's sort of trusteeship of Lebanon. Bravo, Lakhdar Brahimi. But if that's not what we wanted for Iraq, then why did we bring this guy in to choose former MI6 Saudi asset, CIA asset, Ayad Alawi to be the interim prime minister? And why was Ayad Alawi under the impression that he was going to be president for life until early January? You know what I'm saying? When Bush finally went with the idea that we're going to have elections, it's so disjointed. There needed to be a recognition that if you're going to do Iraq, then you're going to be going in a direction where you really may not be able to count on Egypt to allow you to torture people in their country, and Saudi Arabia to be so friendly about allowing you to rendition senior terrorists there either. And a choice needed to be made. You couldn't have your cake and eat it too, as it were.
Well, Eli, I'm tempted to just say I feel your pain and stop there, but I have one more question I've got to ask you, which is the other thing that's always surprised me is the complete lack of intellectual curiosity about what we already knew and didn't know about how to rebuild countries. And, I understand just at a human level the sort of, we don't want to do anything that the Clinton administration did. But the not even, let's go and ask some people and, sort of see what we're good at and what we're not so good at, which there's just a lot of information out there. And you and I were talking the other day about the fact that you've gone on enemy territory and published in the Washington Monthly, and I've actually got a piece with Mortar Bromwitz coming out in the National Interest next month talking about how you've sort of got the right and left together conspiring to convince us that we know a lot more about nation building than we actually do. And I find it so surprising in the run-up to, it's almost as if, having said, okay, we don't like Kosovo, we don't like Bosnia, we don't like Timor, we don't like Haiti, we're not going to talk to any of the people who did that, but we're confident that we can far exceed those achievements in a much bigger and more complex society without checking in on any of it in advance. And that, again, I understand politically, but just, these are smart people, and you would think, Wolfowitz, I had at one time great intellectual respect for. He was a very curious guy. And why didn't anybody think through any of these things?
Honestly, I can tell you that this administration, it was a clusterfuck. Okay, I don't want to use bad language on Blogging Heads, but it was. You had a situation where literally, when the president would make a speech, deputy assistant secretaries would run around saying, "I think that I just heard what the policy is going to be," and you can't run the most powerful country in the world that way. And you can't run a war that way. And that's what happened with the beginning of this stuff, is that Bush would sort of make some utterance about Iran, or Rumsfeld would say, I don't want to see any bottom. There were no major, if you can imagine this, we decided in 2002 to reach out to Skiri and Dawa, the Iranian proxies, that we knew everybody knows the Iranian Revolutionary Guard helped train them, that they were very much Iran's guys, would be in the political system in Iraq. And we pretty much figured out a way to reach out to them. And then we succeeded, but we didn't have a policy on what to do about their accompanying militias. And there was a real debate within the Pentagon about whether or not we would actually shoot Badr Corps guys while we were courting Hakim. I'm just saying this is nuttiness. This is just. So there was a real failure of solving all these major problems. And if you go back, if you go back and you say, and I have a lot of criticisms of this administration, I'm a journalist, almost every single time, like whether it's like how did like only 3 corporate companies like end up bidding on all the reconstruction projects, right? It's all because nobody wanted to make a decision, and there was no process to like sort of just say, okay, sorry, you're going to lose or you're going to win, and so everybody did everything at once. I mean, Colin Powell went to Syria, to sort of give Bashar Assad, sort of last chance. Over strenuous objections of the neocons, but, all the while there were plans being drawn up at the Pentagon about, sort of how to further, sort of increase military pressure on the Syrians, where there had been a decision, which turns out to be right, that the Syrians had pretty much thrown in, with a terror insurgency already. So, so as I said, each one of these cases, I think it was a failure to sort of just decide, and, it was, and that's why we have a lot of these problems.
So, Eli, I hear you saying 2 things, and one is I basically hear you saying that the fish rots from the head down.
Yeah.
And second, the thing that I think I have particular trouble with, having worked in an administration whose early days were described as being like a soccer team of 4-year-olds, before kids have learned to play positions and they just all run after the ball all the time.
Exactly, right.
And so, I mean, I have to say that you've just described something that, of course, bears absolutely no resemblance to what the Bush administration looked like from the outside. And, to a certain extent, I'm willing to believe that everything is always more chaotic than it looks from the outside, except maybe the Clinton administration was less chaotic. You should have been
reading my stuff at the time. No, I'm just kidding. I was writing about this. I wrote about this a lot for the New Republic. I mean, how there was no policy, and they just decided to go with, many things at once. And it was just, that's how they did it.
But I guess I just want to push you a little bit on whether, in fact, maybe there was a policy and it just didn't work. And the appearance of disarray comes from actually the policy basically having been failed in both its basic concepts and its execution.
Well, listen, do I think, there were, yes, on certain very broad questions, was there a policy to get rid of Saddam Hussein? Sure. But, like, how we did it, who we replaced him with, and everything else really wasn't decided. I'm telling you that is really more accurate than, it amazes me to hear still, people sort of demonizing Ahmed Chalabi. And by the way, the guy's no saint, but he never was chosen. There were people who wanted him to be chosen, sure, but he was never the one. So there was really like, it was sort of, there was never, Alawi was chosen at the last minute after we originally were going to go along with somebody who, we had very good reason to believe, had senior ties to nuclear scientists in Iran. I mean, it was sort of, there were a lot of, you have to understand, a lot of this was just sheer incompetence and the failure to make important decisions.
I have to say, those of us on the outside during this period could be forgiven for the feeling that a lot of people were parading around announcing that Ahmed Chalabi had been chosen. And so if, in fact, he hadn't been chosen...
he was a powerful guy in the interim government. He then, if you remember, was, almost arrested by the Alawi government under what ended up being pretty trumped-up charges. He formed what is the UIA, which in retrospect I really wish he hadn't, because it included Muqtada Sadr, and he sort of forged an alliance with Shia theocrats and strengthened his own alliances with what I would say are the worst elements of the Iranians. And anybody who's watched other blogging heads or read my stuff knows that I'm pretty much in the anti-Iran camp, have been for quite some time. And then he very much came back into power because of the 2005 elections at first, and was almost chosen by his caucus as the prime minister, which would have been, in some ways, a delight to see. And I've always felt that Chalabi, if you looked at all of the opposition leaders at the time, in the 90s, was by far the best. And one of the reasons I admit to saying that is because the CIA hated him so much. But,
That's also a pretty damning indictment of the opposition, you have to admit.
I don't think so. Chalabi really... Okay, let me put it like this. All right, I want to be very clear. He's a human being, and he's made decisions, as I said before, regarding Sadr and Iran that I've criticized, written about, and so forth. He's not nearly as awful as Joshua Micah Marshall would have you had believe. And what is amazing is that if you read Marshall, and for that matter, the Knight Ridder Strobel Landay team, who I know and respect and like very much and everything, you had a tremendous amount of negative coverage of Chalabi, and some of it was fair, some of it really wasn't fair. And zero, negative coverage of Ayad Alawi, who ended up being the actual prime minister, and really very little about, the role of some of these other groups. And if you want to search under the fingernails the other Iranian sort of Shiite-related leaders. And I think the reason was because one of the problems with sort of democratic foreign policy right now is that they're kind of in the mode that if it has anything to do with the neoconservatives, they're against it. And, I think it came out that way in part because there was quite a bit of blame shifting that went on after we couldn't find weapons of mass destruction and other sorts of things, and the neocons got stuck with the entire bit of blame. And I wouldn't for a minute say, these are people who were in the administration, but they weren't the only ones who agreed and thought it was okay to invade Iraq. And some of this is based on the fact that I just think that there's an element of the netroots right now that will not let go. It is a matter of faith, Heather, that there had to have been a lie on intelligence to get us into the war, and it was really the work of a shadowy cabal. And instead of just the more obvious and sort of explanation, which is that everybody got something very basic wrong, including, as you know, the Clinton administration thought that Saddam had a weapons program, a pretty serious one, and that the sanctions had failed to curtail it, right?
Except, of course, we kept going with what we were doing, which it turned out worked. But back on Chalabi for a second,
Yeah, okay, we could go back. Yeah, we could go back to Chalabi. I like Chalabi because he was an upfront sort of Democrat, and he was a liberal.
Look, you have two problems with Chalabi. One is that you tried to sell him as a nice liberal Democrat to sort of go along with the height of the neocon dreaming about how Iraq was going to become...
He wasn't Democrat,
Switzerland. So A, you sold him as a much nicer bill of goods than he actually is.
Yeah.
A. And B, he didn't work out. He wasn't able to get the job. He wasn't able to unite Iraq around him. He turned out to not be very effective. So
that's because we didn't choose him in the beginning.
Yeah, but he was sold to Americans very, very hard by, a faction of the administration that maybe didn't have everyone's total confidence, but you went out and sold him as the face of the new Iraq, and then he turned out, A, to have a somewhat less pretty face, and B, not to be able to get in there and work. I think a similar thing was done on a smaller scale with Alawi, who, again, if you look, turns out to be, a somewhat compromised individual, and B, wasn't able to get the job done, and now, I guess, has hired a PR firm to try to convince everybody that he needs another shot. And, this is what happens when you go in and break up a dirty government, that you have a dirty mess to replace it with.
Well, it doesn't even, first of all, you can't compare the sadism of Saddam's state to Chalabi or Alawi or anybody who came after him. That's just not yet.
But who knows how bad
it's not even a not yet. It's just like it's not even close. it was an extraordinary, even as far as dictatorships go. Saddam's was extraordinarily evil. I think we can all agree with that, right? It was. I think there was a bureaucracy of rapists under him, and it was a series of things that were just. It wasn't just that. I don't think Saddam just killed people for political utility. I think he killed people in part, or at least his sons killed people for pleasure. And if you look at the legacy, I wouldn't want to necessarily be so quick to claim the sanctions as having been an effective foreign policy, given that what we know is that we allowed Saddam to deliberately malnourish so many Iraqis under that system. I think sanctions in some ways proved that you couldn't really... he was able to amass more power, and the sanctions originally under Bush 1 was a way to try to get people to sort of overthrow him from some, sort of put pressure on the... Which we know now doesn't work. So let's just agree left and right, Heather. Sanctions against a population doesn't help you change the regime of a tyrant, right?
I don't think I want to agree with your basic premise. Saddam definitely would make my top 5 list of evil tyrants in countries that have a lot of oil. But if you had to actually include countries that nobody cares what the dictators do to their citizens,
you're going to nominate Slork and...
he'd still be pretty... it wouldn't change that he was an evil man who ran an evil regime, but you can't get around that the reason we were interested in doing something about Saddam and not interested in doing something about, sort of 5 or 10 other guys is that Saddam was sitting on a very strategic piece of real estate with some strategic natural resources. And so once you've acknowledged that, you have to get off your high horse a little bit about, failure or success of various policies, because you say,
I absolutely admit that. Yeah, absolutely. He was sitting on a lot of oil, hence all the more reason not to let this madman reap the profits of that oil program and bribe as he had. as he did in the 1990s and before the war, a good chunk of the international community. I mean, it's really more of a scandal, I suppose, in France, but I mean, even our country, we have people who were effectively bribed by Saddam's massive oil wealth. And, I think the presence of Saddam Hussein undermines an international system. Just like I think the current, Iranian regime, because if you have powerful actors that really have no interest in abiding by international law and actually in some ways, in important ways, subvert it, whether it's through the sponsorship of terrorism or, the out-and-out bribery of UN officials, then, they become themselves a problem to the international system itself. So I was very sympathetic to sort of the international legal argument in 2003, which is that we kind of have to break international law in order to enforce it. And that is a serious problem, Heather, that if you don't have an enforcement mechanism for the international system, then it's going to be hard for anyone to call it anything more than a debating society, right?
Now, this is a fabulous moment to demonstrate the difference between neocons and Kosovo Democrats, which is that you say that, and I agree with you in principle, but what we've done in Iraq has actually now damaged the international system even more than Saddam was damaging the international system, and we've damaged the prospects for there being any kind of enforcement mechanism that anybody will sign up to. Have been far more damaged by what's happened in Iraq since 2002 than they were by what happened in Iraq the decade after the first Iraq War. So
Can we just tell them to
the
get
cure
over
was
it?
worse than the disease in this case.
I don't know. I like throwing American power around, I do. I just admit
I appreciate you being honest about it.
I am. I mean, there's sometimes I hear about, when you guys talk about, the international community, we're getting a lot of protest and public opinion from the Europeans. I'm like, what are you going to do about it? We still put the Pershings in Germany. We saved your butts and, whatever. I don't know. It's just it's a sentiment. It's not an argument, Heather. I'm just saying.
Mm-hmm. Right, no, and that's, back to our first topic, that is a problem that Democrats have, that people like me who tend to be attracted to these issues in the party are not people who necessarily have as much of that gut feeling. I'm not saying I have none of it. Certainly,
you had to deal with Hubert Vedrine when you were in the White House.
I was just suppressing the urge to tell a story, and what the hell, I won't suppress it. A person I worked for once came out of a meeting with a very important European organization, turned to one of my colleagues and said, "It's like taking little boys to the bathroom. You have to tell them to wash their hands." And that was a very prominent Democrat. So, I totally sympathize with your feeling. It's just that, as in life, you can't let that be what drives your decision making.
No, obviously. And, when Rumsfeld said old Europe, that hurt us. I agree. No, listen, I agree.
Look, I believe in pissing people off for a reason. I believe in not pissing people
totally
off just to piss them off.
We agree on this. I understand, because I covered the State Department and I covered diplomacy. There is such a thing as skilled diplomacy and then, bungling, idiotic
unskilled diplomacy. Yeah.
And I do understand that. However, you guys sometimes, really do put way too much emphasis on exactly, where the teaspoon is going to be put in the, who cares? At a certain point, there are certain people, like this Iran stuff, Heather, I'm going to be honest with you, and I know we're a little off topic. You could have the best diplomats in the history of diplomacy, okay? You know what I mean? You could get Dean Acheson himself, okay? It's not going to change anything with the Iranians, all right? They are a revolution. They're not a country. They are psyched to be at war. We can be nice to them. We can be mean to them. We can give speeches. We could not give speeches. It's just going to be how it is. I just don't see at this point. Especially if you look at it over sort of a period of time. I don't think that there's any amount of diplomacy that can heal that rift. You know what I'm saying?
Well, A, I think that's an extraordinarily simplistic view of an extraordinarily complex society.
All right.
And B, I just want to remind you of what I said earlier about the fish rotting from the head down. Yeah, diplomacy only gets you so far if you don't have strong political will and smart political leadership behind it, and that's a problem this administration has had in dealing with Iran. It's also, you got to be honest, you can have people on the Iranian side who are negotiating and are not, can't deliver on what they promised because their leader is a crazy guy who is much more interested in consolidating his own power base and doing crazy things around the world than he is in anything else. So yeah, okay.
Well, that kind of proves my point, right? On the Iran side, I don't think that Javad Zarif at the UN is there to really reflect the thinking of the supreme leader. I think he's there to lie to Americans and Europeans about how benign the intentions are of the Iranians.
See, I would put it as he's there and he reflects one facet of Iranian society and the Iranian political structure. It's not the dominant facet, but it is a facet.
They're
and so
neutered.
your judgments need to be a little more sophisticated than just these people aren't a country, they're a revolution. And if I think that's the basis of policymaking, I'm really worried, and I don't.
Well, I say that Iran as a regime is not a country so much as it wants to be a revolution, because that's exactly how they act. I mean, they've built a revolutionary terror army that is terrorizing the Middle East and now terrorizing us in Iraq. And and I don't think that I think they've made it pretty clear from their actions, not to mention a lot of their speeches, that they're not really interested in talking right now. They think that they're ascendant, and they're nuts. Did you see this God's Warriors thing when Christiane Amanpour went to Qom? They have that office there for like when the imam returns.
Fourth imam comes back.
Yeah, I just think this is like a major project. It would be like if NASA had a project to like what to do when the aliens invaded, and we spent a lot of like most of our defense budget on that or something. I mean, it's
actually, Eli, I was going to say it would be like if there were senior U.S. generals who went about talking about what would happen when the rapture comes and what has to happen to infidels.
Don't get me started on that. I'm first of all a pretty secular guy, and second of all, that's not like policy. A lot of people in the military are religious. I'm like,
I'm actually. This is so fun when everything is flipped backward, because I'm actually a fairly religious person myself, but I don't expect the rapture in our days, sadly.
Right.
Now I'm just teasing you. But, I think the point that one can take a set of pretty scary impressions away from this country right now, and some of us think that it actually doesn't, it may very well reflect what some people in this government want, but it doesn't reflect anything that's actually going to happen.
Oh, but come on, you're not going there, are you? No, there's a world of difference.
I'm not making a one-on-one comparison. I'm not naive enough to do that. Right. But I also think that you are applying a very broad brush to Iranian society, which is maybe not a useful way to think about what is a very, very threatening and bad situation.
Honestly, I've been to Iran, and I'm very much aware that there are people in Iran who want nothing to do with this, okay? And it's very much it's rotted out in a lot of ways. But the people in charge, particularly the people in charge of the torture centers, the people in charge of the brown shirt Basij, the people in charge of the military, the people in charge of the nukes, the people in charge of the security services, the people in charge of dragging people from their homes and forcing them to make confessions on national television. Those people are stone cold crazy. They're nuts. Not the people who are at Tehran University, not the people who, are writing in their blogs and scared that that the Inquisitor is going to knock on the door. Those people are not nuts. I want to empower those people, figure out as best we can. I'd love to work with them if they want us to work with them. I don't know.
But
I'm talking about the people who are in charge of the apparatuses of the state that are most important to the regime's survival are nuts. They really are, and I think we have to come to terms with that. I mean, and they in the last 3 years, they've committed a slow motion coup because they got rid of every reformer. I mean, they in 2004, they told the reformers they could not run for re-election to the Majlis. And it was pretty arbitrary. They've arrested a lot of key guys who we used to talk to on, orders from Khatami and the president. So the era of Khatami is over. They tried that experiment. It's over. And now the lunatics are in charge.
But, Eli, I think your own argument kind of undermines the idea that they're all nuts. They seem to me to be people whose belief system is very alien to me, but who are sort of consolidating political power in a pretty classical manner and who have very adroitly seized on this. So, it's not helpful to run around going, they're crazy.
Right.
They act under political imperatives just, like other dictators in other places do. And, the second thing is, look, this is just a crummy situation where we have no good options. It's very unclear that you can concoct a military option that actually solves the problem.
Of course. I'm not saying no one can invade Iran. Oh, God, no.
Right,
absolutely
you can't invade
not.
Iran, and it's very unclear that targeted strikes would solve the problem and not actually make it worse. So that being the case, you then kind of have to ratchet yourself back down from they're all crazy and out to destroy the world and say, okay, we've got a bunch of crappy options. How can we play this hand as smartly as possible? And sort of running around foaming at the mouth makes it harder, not easier.
Well, first of all, I don't think I'm foaming at the mouth. I think it's important that we recognize what their intentions are, which really to really fix in our heads as the West, we can't let these people get nuclear weapons. It's really important, not because I think there's going to be a first strike, Because I don't want them to have, like, a nuclear insurance policy for their terrorism.
But they already have a nuclear insurance policy for their terrorism. I mean, this is sort of the falseness about this discussion. The reason that we have the problem we have right now, and that the whole reason you and I are having this conversation, is they already have the ability to prevent us from knowing that we've wiped out their bomb-making capability. So in some important, unpleasant way, they already have what you're talking about.
In an important, unpleasant way. That's different than having an actual nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
It's also different than having a scenario where leadership of Iran, as diverse and uncrazy as they are, give, I think, a speech every week saying how wonderful it will be when they take out Jerusalem and destroy Israel. And even if they don't do it, the effect of that on not just Israel, but like everybody else who might be in the way of Iran is pretty significant. So there's quite a bit of a difference between what we have now, which I agree with you is not very good, and then what we would have down the road. And, listen, if it was possible to work out a deal where I thought, you could get Rafsanjani to sort of take over, and then he would ratchet it down, and you would have some sort of détente at this point, then I'm not necessarily against that. I just don't think that, like, anybody who gets to that level of exalted position within Iranian society is not nuts, and I just don't believe in this notion that there are these Iranian moderates. I think there were Iranian moderates who really wanted to reform the system, and they were pretty much, squashed. So, I mean, I wouldn't have necessarily said this in 2000. I certainly feel comfortable saying it in 2007. And while I agree that we can't necessarily talk about invading it, I don't think it should be in any way. I think we should I don't think it would be such a bad idea to take out what we know to be many a spinning centrifuge. I mean, I think that would help at least. And also, I might add, and this might sort of be getting into, is that, we're already, if we can figure out a way to sabotage it, I don't know that that's a high chance of probability or success, but, miracle of miracles, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. And at some point, we should, think about, down the road, what I wanted 5 years ago, I might add, is a Madeleine Albright Serbia plan. I said this to Rosa Brooks a while back. Open up, try to work with their already indigenous and outraged opposition.
Well, the interesting thing about that last piece is that the administration has sort of tried to do that, and I have to say I worked a lot on the Madeleine Albright Serbia plan, and
which was the great success, I might add, of the Clinton years.
Yeah,
really, that was the coup de grace.
It went very badly at first, and it was very frustrating and very hard to figure out how to do it. And ultimately, it worked, but the primary impetus was less anything we did than that you finally had that generation of kids that just said, okay, this is embarrassing. And then we had this stuff in place to help them.
Right.
But the initial phase where, we were trying to help, and it was mostly groups from outside, and it was very obvious who we were helping, and there were American Serbs marching in Chicago with placards that said Madeleine Albright speaks with a Croatian accent, was pretty awful. And the administration has been so ham-handed in its eagerness to hand out huge chunks of money to prominent Iranian Americans, and it's been so eager to claim a sort of propaganda victory for doing this that it's made it almost impossible for real Iranian dissidents to get anywhere near any of the resources. So, the good news is that has occurred to somebody. The bad news is the way it's been done, I think, has delayed even further the chances of it actually working.
Yeah, I mean, there's other problems too, and that you did have Europe as one voice could influence Serbia in a way that they can't as much in Iran. So you had this diplomatic element there. That's not there really as much in Iran, I think. And,
well, actually, I think even more important than the diplomatic element was the economic, cultural pull of the EU. That there was something that young Serbs, and frankly, this has worked well in Croatia and even somewhat in Bosnia too, and it's what saved Northern Ireland. That there was something bigger that they could aspire to, that they could only get to by stepping back a little bit from some of the violence and hate in the society. And it's just hard, and this is, I think, the thing that's ultimately so devastating when you look at Iraq, is it's hard to see what the force could be that gives a younger generation something more hopeful to aspire to. And, frankly, the thing that's made peace building in Europe work as well as it has is that sort of economic and cultural pull of the EU, and that's just not replicable anywhere else.
Well, yes and no. I like Gene Sharp's theories a lot on this. I think at a certain point, if population decides no more, we won't, and that you can get enough people all at once sort of resisting or disobeying, then it's easy. You can bring down these regimes as nasty as they are. You have examples in other countries where civil disobedience has worked, and it certainly drove out Marcos, and the Europeans were there. So I'd like to be optimistic about that. And in the long run, I suppose I am optimistic, but I'm very worried about the nuclear question with Iran. And see, there's another issue here, Heather, which is that I don't think sometimes that the Kosovo Democrats, and certainly not some of the other camps within the Democratic Party, really want to kind of grapple with the fact that for Iran, terrorism is probably the primary ways in which they wage war. And if we don't hold them accountable for that, then I think in the end we're sort of we're not really. I mean, we have to sort of understand that by sponsoring people to kill us and others in the region, that this is a form of war, even though they haven't sent tanks across a border. Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, I don't have any problem with that as a statement. But this again comes back to what I said before about what it is that whether it's your emotions or your mind that dictates how you make policy. And so, hold them accountable is a great phrase, and I would use it in a speech anytime. But then the question becomes, how do you hold them accountable in a way that makes your situation better and not worse? And that's where some sort of really careful thinking and less, they're evil, they're all evil, flinging up. Well,
can I give you a possible sort of spitball in here? Okay, about 14 months ago, Heather, I'm going to remember his name. Saeed Mortazavi was sent as one of the delegations to the new UN human rights thing in Geneva. Okay. And the Canadian Prime Minister was worried because Saeed Mortazavi was the chief prosecutor who sent Zahra Kazemi to prison, where she was raped and killed.
To be beaten to death, yeah.
And so they consider Saeed Mortazavi a wanted man, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they basically said, hey, this guy is traveling through Munich. He will arrive in Geneva at a certain time. Could you please arrest him? We have a arrest warrant out through Interpol. Mm-hmm. I don't see any reason why, to a certain degree, we can't do that. I mean, not like a guy like Ahmed Vahidi or, Qasem Soleimani or any of these people are ever going to probably leave Iran, but, to a certain extent, can we seize their assets if they're elsewhere? So that's one way.
We totally agree on that. That's what the international justice system is for. To say if you do that kind of thing, you're stuck in your own country.
Well, but I mean, the sad story is that, in fact, none of the Europeans went along with it because, there were more important negotiations with them.
Right.
But more, and finally, in certain cases, at this point, I've just maybe because I'm paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Iraq right now, and anybody who says the Iranians aren't playing a big role in killing our soldiers there and really a big actor in the war right now for Iraq, I think is not really considering most of the evidence. I think at a certain point you have to sort of say we would consider the head of the Quds force in Iran a military target, and if we have a target of opportunity, we'll kill him.
I mean,
which is sort of what this decision on the Revolutionary Guard, designation, I think, is all about.
Well, that's a good pivot to Iraq, I think, for a little bit. Because my question about that is, so yes, you say to Iran, we know what you're doing in Iraq. It's it comes close to an act of war against us, but so you retaliate. But as long as the situation in Iraq remains as unsettled as it is, and as long as we're as big and tempting a target there as we are, that behavior's not going to change. So that's a case where just saying, we're going to retaliate against you, as long as we don't do anything to remove the source of the vulnerability, isn't going to change the behavior.
I disagree. I think that if you can, it's quite possible to create. I think that just as they're trying to make the cost of our staying in Iraq so high that we'll leave, I think we can make the cost of their war making in Iraq so high that they cut it out. You know what I'm saying?
No, I'm not sure I agree on either count, because my view is they actually like things just about as they are, with us providing some sort of minimal control over the chaos, but also tied down and looking weak. And so actually they enjoy harassing us, but they don't really want us to completely pack up and go.
Right.
And similarly, because, you try to imagine if Iraq were Mexico, they're not going to totally pack up and go no matter what we do. So I think it's unrealistic to
pack up and go. If they were there, trying to just simply open, cell phone, systems or whatever, then I wouldn't care.
Or even if they were there supporting militias but not actively targeting Americans,
they're bankrolling armies of ethnic cleansers. That's what they're doing. So I'm against ethnic cleansing. So therefore, I'm against the Iranian presence. And it has cost so many lives. The cost is so high that I don't have a problem with killing the people who are the architects of that, and they should know that their life is in peril. What's wrong with that? I mean, that there's a very high cost for doing this sort of thing, and that it will end with you either dead or in jail.
So your idea is that by taking out some Iranian military targets, you convert Iran's attitude in Iraq to a constructive one where Iran would actually help rein in the ethnic militias.
I think it's quite possible to go after, as Petraeus is doing right now in most of Iraq, their network. I mean, we have much more than the Erbil 5 in jail right now.
Right, but going
and
after
we've killed
their
a lot
network,
of people too. I think that's what you have to do at a certain. But you have to just sort of. I mean, if you were to negotiate with them and say, okay, what can we do to get you to stop killing us, then we're sort of giving into blackmail, and we're, I think, indirectly encouraging this sort of behavior. And by the way, I mean, if you look at the history of the modern Islamic, Republic of Iran, it is a history of them finding out that, terrorism and kidnapping pays. I mean, that we signed the Algiers Accord after they kidnap our diplomats. In the 1980s, we get our hostages back by having the Israelis sell them tow missiles. I mean, and on and on and on. So terrorism really works for the Iranians. And so in some ways, we are responsible for encouraging it.
Well, it's called asymmetrical power, and it's kind of an ugly fact of life.
It is an ugly fact of life. And maybe we should also think about ways of using asymmetrical power against the Iranians. I mean, I don't have a problem with helping. If we make a real commitment to the Kurds to sort of protect them, there are 10 million Kurds in Iran. Why don't we get the Kurds to cause them a lot more problems? Something that Asai Hirsch has accused the U.S. of doing, which they haven't done yet. But it would, there's all kinds of things that we can do to make their life miserable, to be very nasty to them.
Again, I really don't. I mean, all of these things sound interesting. I think where we differ is how carefully you are thinking through the consequences of what you do. And inciting the Kurds in Iran sounds like exactly something that ultimately causes a lot more difficulty for us than it helps. Did you really want to give the Turks yet one more reason to be hysterical? Do you really want to give the Iraqi Kurds one more reason to sort of secretly think that they'll get out one day?
Come on. I mean, so the Iraqi Kurds already think that secretly they are going to get out.
Of course they do, but why would you want to?
I mean, there's nothing we can do about that. That's how it is being a Kurd. They're waiting for this moment.
Why would we want to make it? Why would we want to sort of reinforce that point of view? And why would we want to undermine, everything that we say that we want for Iraq?
For Iraq to be whole and free.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I'm saying that you can do certain.
I'm not the one who came up with that.
Yes, Europe. Did you come up with Europe whole and free?
Oh, Lord, no, that predates me.
Oh, okay.
Besides,
no, I mean, listen. I would.
I'm old school, and if I had come up with it, I wouldn't take credit for it.
Nice.
Damn it, I am really old school on that stuff.
Nice. I like that attitude. I've never been a speechwriter. I've always been a journalist. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking. I'm saying that there are things that we should be able to do to the Iranians, and we're already doing. I mean, let's be honest. If we're all the financial designations the Treasury Department's doing is a form of economic warfare. So we should. I mean, the problem is that sometimes when people talk about, well, I don't want to admit that Iran is doing all these terrible things because you might just want to invade it. I want to take invasion off the table. But there are plenty of things the U.S. government can do to make, the lives of nasty regimes miserable. I'm sort of in favor of, at this point, sort of fighting back and increasing the cost for them. But at the same time, I mean, yeah, on the Kurdish question, let me address the Kurdish question. the Kurds could be our allies in Iran, and, I don't know, I think we could finesse it so that we don't get them to become, it's not like a separatist movement or something like that, but we can do things that make it very difficult for them. What about just having Kurds demand equal rights that they don't have right now in Iran, which is really what the Kurds of Turkey have been doing for 30 years, right?
Well, now stop and think about this. You're an Iranian Kurd, and you know the recent history of the region really well. And you remember, what happened to the Iraqi Kurds in the early 90s when they demanded rights they didn't then have, and you remember what the U.S. did about that. You also look at what has happened in Iraq since the war, and you say to yourself, do I want to live like that? No, I really don't. And so you're going to get a certain radical fringe that are going to say, oh yeah, anything that helps us, fight the man. But you're going to have the vast majority of Iranian Kurds, and we've done this to ourselves, by the way, say, well, look, the U.S. Is not really capable of delivering on its promises. And that is it's a terrible thing for us just in terms of statecraft generally, and in this situation specifically, that the Iraq project, the sort of hubris and poor execution of the Iraq project has actually made its goals harder to reach rather than easier. And I think, the idea that you could appeal to Iranian Kurds and they wouldn't say, what, are you kidding? We stand up to Tehran. They come up here and beat down on us, and you guys stand there and say,
first of all, there are a lot of
fuck,
Iranian Kurds that have been standing up to Iran regardless of our encouragement, because we haven't been encouraging it per se. So that's just going on. That's a result of having to live under these horrible mullahs, who are terrible. Then, add to that if we sort of, I don't think it's a matter of, I don't care if Deputy Secretary of State Negroponte gives a speech about how terrible it is to be an Iranian Kurd. It's not a matter of sort of public support so much, but there are certainly groups that I've interviewed that are based in Iraqi Kurdistan that, we could easily go to. They have some networks in Iran. And there are things that they can do to make life more difficult for the Iranians. And I don't see what the problem is there, because it's like everyone says, well, what are the consequences? Don't you think the Iranians are going to get mad and do other bad stuff? I think if you look at Iraq right now, it doesn't get much worse than what the Iranians are doing.